The morning sky looked calm when Clara stepped out of the small train station with her suitcase in hand. She was only 23, wearing a faded blue dress, her brown hair tied neatly under a bonnet. Her heart was full of hope. She had left Kansas behind, her old life of endless dust and loneliness, to become a mail-order bride in Texas. The letter from her future husband, Thomas Hale, had been kind and warm. He had written that he worked near a small town called Dry Creek, where he owned a small ranch and dreamed of building a family. Clara had read that letter 100 times during the long journey. When she climbed into the waiting stagecoach, the driver looked at her with surprise. "You sure you want to go to Dry Creek, miss?" he asked, tightening the reins on the horses. "Rain's been heavy for 2 days out there. The hill roads ain't easy." Clara gave a polite smile and nodded. "My husband-to-be is waiting there. I can't make him wait any longer." The driver shrugged, tipped his hat, and cracked the whip. The wheels began to roll through the muddy path, shaking gently as they climbed uphill. The road stretched far and lonely across green meadows and rocky slopes. Every now and then, Clara looked out of the window. She saw the clouds gathering like gray curtains across the sky. Wind began to whistle through the valley. Inside the coach, she took out Thomas's photograph, a young man in his late 20s, standing proudly beside a horse. His eyes seemed honest and his smile gentle. She whispered softly, "Soon, Thomas. I'm almost there." But the storm had other plans. By noon, the sky had turned dark. Thick rain began to fall, pounding on the roof of the coach. The driver shouted over the noise, urging the horses to keep moving. The wheels splashed through growing puddles. Trees swayed violently and thunder rolled across the distant hills. Clara held on tightly, her heart pounding. The driver yelled, "Hang on, miss!" The pass gets narrow ahead. The coach tilted as one wheel sank into soft mud, but the driver pulled it free with skill. The horses struggled but obeyed. The rain didn't stop. It poured harder, soaking everything. Clara felt the chill crawl up her arms. She closed her eyes and prayed quietly, asking God to keep them safe. Hours passed. The road became worse. Streams overflowed and small rocks slid down the hillsides. Finally, as evening approached, the driver called out, "Dry Creek's just a few miles more. We'll make it before dark." Clara's heart lifted. She imagined Thomas waiting near the town's edge, waving as the coach arrived. She imagined a warm house, a clean dress, a new life filled with laughter instead of silence. But as the coach climbed the last ridge, the rain eased, and the world grew strangely quiet. The driver slowed down, staring ahead with disbelief. "Good Lord," he whispered. Clara leaned forward, looking out through the wet glass. What she saw made her breath catch. The valley below looked nothing like a town anymore. Where the roofs of Dry Creek once stood, there was now only a vast brown scar across the earth. Mud covered most of the valley. A few rooftops stuck out of the dirt like islands in a brown sea. The church steeple was broken. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. Everything was silent, too silent. The driver shook his head slowly. The mountain must have given way. Whole places buried. Clara couldn't speak. Her throat closed and tears filled her eyes. She stepped out of the coach, her boots sinking into the wet ground. The air smelled of mud and broken wood. Somewhere a dog barked weakly and then went silent. "I need to go down there," she said softly. The driver looked alarmed. "Ma'am, it ain't safe. The ground's still soft, might slide again." But Clara only clutched her suitcase tighter. "He's down there," she said, her voice trembling. "Thomas is there. I have to find him." The driver hesitated but finally nodded. "I'll wait by the ridge for a while, miss. But be careful." Clara nodded and began walking downhill, her dress heavy with rainwater, her shoes slipping in the mud. Each step sank deep, pulling at her strength, but she kept going. The silence of the valley felt strange, like the world was holding its breath. When she reached the edge of what used to be the main street, she saw the wreckage of wagons and fences half buried under thick mud. The blacksmith's sign barely hung on one nail. She called out, "Thomas, can you hear me?" Her voice echoed back with no answer. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind a cold mist. The only sound was her breathing and the faint creak of broken wood shifting under the mud. She kept calling out until her voice cracked. Her legs trembled from exhaustion. Finally, she dropped her suitcase and sank to her knees. "Please," she whispered, "just let me find him." She sat there for a long moment, tears mixing with dirt on her face. Her dreams of love, of starting anew, of a small ranch with a white fence, all seemed to fade into the wet ground before her. As dusk fell, she noticed movement near what looked like a fallen barn. A figure stepped out from behind it, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a soaked hat and carrying a rifle. For a second, Clara froze in fear. "Stay where you are, miss," the man called out in a deep voice. She didn't move. The man walked closer, his boots sinking with each step. His coat was torn, and his face was partly hidden by the brim of his hat. When he got close enough to see her clearly, his tone softened. "You shouldn't be here. The land's still dangerous." "I'm looking for someone," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Thomas Hale, he lives here. Or he did." The man looked away for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I know that name," he said finally. "He works near the creek." I'm sorry, miss. The slide took everything. I helped pull some folks out, but..." His voice trailed off. Clara's heart sank. The world spun around her, and she felt her knees weaken. The man caught her before she fell, his grip firm but gentle. "Easy now," he said quietly. "You need to rest. There's a cabin up the ridge that's still standing. Come on, I'll take you there." Too tired to argue, Clara let him guide her. They walked in silence, the soft sound of mud squelching underfoot. She noticed he walked with a slight limp, his movements careful but strong. When they reached the cabin, the man pushed open the door. Inside, it was dry and warm, with a small fire already burning. He set his rifle aside and offered her a wooden chair near the hearth. "Name's Elias Ford," he said finally. "Used to be with the Rangers. Now I just help where I can." Clara looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you, Mr. Ford. I didn't know where else to go." He poured her some water from a jug and handed it to her. "You're safe here for the night," he said. "Tomorrow, if you still want, I'll help you look for him." Clara nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she took a sip. The water was cold but steadying. She looked around the small cabin. 2 chairs, a cot, a few shelves of tools. It wasn't much, but it felt safe, like a small light in a world of darkness. Outside, the rain began to fall again, softer this time. Clara sat quietly by the fire, watching the flames dance. Her heart still hurt, but she felt something else now, a strange sense of peace. The storm had taken so much, yet this stranger's kindness gave her a small reason to hold on. Elias sat near the door, watching the storm through the window. He didn't say much, but in his eyes was the calm of a man who had seen too much loss and still chose to help. And that night, as the wind whispered outside and the fire cracked softly, Clara understood one thing clearly. Even in the middle of ruin, there could still be kindness. Even after everything was washed away, someone could still stand beside you and help you survive. She closed her eyes, whispering a quiet prayer for the man who had saved her and for the town buried beneath the mud. Tomorrow would bring new pain, but maybe also a new beginning. The next morning, Clara woke up to the sound of birds and the soft crackling of fire. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The cabin walls were warm from the early sun, and smoke from the fireplace curled gently through the small chimney. Then she remembered everything: the storm, the ruined town, the stranger who had helped her. Elias Ford stood near the door, pouring water into a tin cup. He looked calm and steady, his face half hidden under his hat. He turned when he heard her move. "Mornin', miss. You slept through the night," he said softly. "That's a good sign." Clara sat up, brushing her hair from her face. "Thank you," she said in a quiet voice, "for bringing me here." "I didn't even know where I was anymore." Elias nodded. "You were near the creek. Not a safe place to stay after a slide. The ground there's still soft. You did the right thing following me." She looked down at her hands. They were still dirty from the mud, her dress torn at the hem. "Is it really gone?" "The whole town?" she asked. Elias sighed and rested his hands on his belt. "Mostly. The slide came down from the ridge like a wave, buried half the valley in minutes. I was out on the hills when it started. By the time I got here, the water was already rising. I tried to pull out whoever I could, but..." He stopped, his voice low and heavy. Clara didn't need to hear the rest. She looked out the window where the sun touched the broken valley below. Roofs were still buried under thick brown earth. Nothing moved except a few blackbirds searching for food. After a long silence, she spoke again. "Thomas Hale, do you think there's any chance he's alive?" Elias looked at her carefully, as if afraid to give her false hope. "I can't say for sure," he said slowly. "If he made it to the upper barn before the hill broke, maybe. But it's been 2 days now. I've seen no sign. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth to stop herself from crying. She took a deep breath, then whispered, "I need to know for certain." "I can't leave without trying." Elias nodded. "Then I'll go with you," he said firmly. "But you'll need to eat first." He handed her a plate of beans and bread he had cooked over the fire. Clara wasn't hungry, but she ate because he watched with quiet concern. There was something about him, something solid and dependable, like an old oak tree that had seen many storms but still stood tall. When they set out, the morning light made the valley look softer. The air smelled of wet soil and pine. Clara carried a lantern and a small shovel. Elias carried his rifle, more for wild animals than people now. As they walked, she noticed how silent the world had become. No laughter, no children playing, no sound of horses, only the distant dripping of water from rocks. When they reached the old church, half of its roof was gone. The cross on top leaned at a strange angle. Elias stopped beside the remains of the general store and pointed. This was the main street. The creek ran right behind those buildings. If Thomas had a place here, it would be close. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the wreckage. She recognized a half-buried sign that read Hale's Feed and Tack. Her heart skipped. "That's his," she said. They hurried closer. Most of the building was crushed under mud and wood. Elias tested the ground with his boot, making sure it wouldn't sink. "Stay behind me," he warned. Together they dug through the debris. The mud was thick and heavy, and Clara's hands soon turned raw. Elias worked silently, strong and patient. Every so often, he stopped to help her breathe or rest. After nearly an hour, they found a few broken items: a saddle, a lantern, and a photograph frame covered in dirt. Clara wiped it with her sleeve. It was Thomas, smiling in the same photo she carried in her bag. Her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she whispered, "He was real. He was here." Elias looked at her gently. "He must have cared for you, writing you like that. Not many men take the time to do that anymore." Clara smiled faintly. "He said he wanted a home, someone to share quiet mornings with. He wrote about sunsets and horses. He made it sound like a peaceful life." Elias looked at the ruined valley. "It was," he said softly, "till the earth gave way." They searched until the sun began to dip behind the ridge. The shadows stretched long and the wind turned cool. Finally, Elias said, "That's enough for today. We'll come back tomorrow. You can't help the dead if you make yourself sick." Clara nodded weakly. Her body ached, but her spirit still refused to give up. As they climbed back up to the cabin, she stumbled once and Elias caught her arm. His hand was warm, strong, and steady. For a brief moment, she felt safe again. When they reached the cabin, Elias started a fire and hung her wet shawl near the flames. He moved quietly with a calm rhythm that comforted her. After a while, he poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. "You got courage, Miss Clara," he said finally. "Most would have turned back at the sight of that valley. But not you." Clara looked at the fire, her eyes reflecting the glow. "When you travel this far for something you believe in, you can't just stop halfway," she said softly. "Even if it hurts," Elias nodded. "I used to think that way too," he said. "Before I learned sometimes it hurts more to keep going." She looked up, curious. "You've lost someone too?" Elias stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "A few years back, I worked for the Texas Rangers. My brother rode with me. We were chasing a gang near the border. We caught them, but it went wrong. The crossfire took lives it shouldn't have. My brother was one of them. I left after that. Couldn't wear the badge again." Clara's heart softened. "I'm sorry," she said gently. Elias shrugged slightly, though his eyes were full of quiet pain. "Ain't your fault. Life's got a way of breaking men, but sometimes it gives you another chance to do right." They sat in silence, listening to the fire pop. Clara realized that this man, who once carried a badge and now lived alone, wasn't just helping her out of kindness. Maybe in some way he was helping himself too. Later that night, a soft rain began again, tapping gently on the roof. Clara couldn't sleep. She watched Elias through the dim light of the fire. He sat near the window, his rifle leaning beside him, eyes alert even in quiet. She wondered how long he had been living this way, guarding, surviving, but never resting. "Mr. Ford," she said softly, "why did you stay near Dry Creek when everyone else left?" He didn't look away from the window. Someone had to. When the slide hit, folks scattered. I knew there'd be people who needed help. Guess I just couldn't walk away. Clara smiled faintly. "You call that guilt? I call it heart." He chuckled quietly, the first real smile she had seen from him. You talk mighty brave for someone who just lost her whole world. I haven't lost everything, she replied. I'm still here. And you're here. That's something. Elias didn't answer, but there was a gentleness in his eyes now, a quiet respect. When the fire burned low, Clara finally closed her eyes. She dreamed of home, of wide fields and blue skies. But this time she also dreamed of a man standing guard by her side, a man with a weary heart who still believed in protecting others. In the morning, when she woke, the cabin was quiet again. Elias was already outside chopping wood. She watched from the window, the rising sun painting everything golden. For the first time since she arrived, the valley didn't look only broken, it looked alive again in small ways. She stepped outside and said, "Good morning." Elias looked up, smiled slightly, and nodded. "Mornin', Miss Clara, ready to face another day?" She nodded firmly. "Yes, if you'll help me." He rested the axe on the ground and tipped his hat. "Then you've got yourself a partner." And for the first time since the storm, Clara felt a faint warmth in her heart, a sign that maybe she wasn't meant to walk this road alone anymore. The sun rose over the muddy valley like a shy guest after a long storm. Golden light touched the broken town below, and mist lifted slowly from the wet earth. Inside the cabin, Clara helped Elias pack tools into a wooden crate, shovels, ropes, lanterns, and a few old blankets. They were going back down again to search for more survivors and supplies. Elias tied the last rope and looked at her with a calm expression. "You sure you're ready?" Clara nodded firmly. "If I stay here doing nothing, I'll go mad. I need to help." He gave a small approving nod. "Then we work together. Just stay close. The ground's still not steady in places." They left the cabin, their boots squishing through the damp grass. The air smelled clean and sharp, the kind of air that only comes after rain. Birds had returned to the trees, and a few deer stood watching from the ridge. It was strange. So much life around them, even after so much loss. When they reached the edge of the ruined town, Clara stopped to take it in again. The world she had come so far to join now looked like a ghost village. Silent, buried, forgotten. Yet she felt something pull her forward, like hope still hiding under all that mud. They began their work carefully. Elias searched the edges of buildings, checking for signs of collapse. Clara helped pull out wooden boards and clear small paths. As they worked, they found scattered belongings, baby shoes, a tin cup, an old Bible half covered in dirt. Each object felt like a whisper from someone's life. Clara picked up a child's doll, its face cracked but still smiling. She brushed off the mud gently. "It's strange," she said softly. "These things still look alive even when their owners are gone." Elias paused from his work and looked at her. "Sometimes that's all that's left to tell their story," he said. By afternoon, they discovered a half-collapsed barn. The wooden beams had held up better than most. Elias pushed open the door and called out, "Anybody here?" His deep voice echoed, then faded. No answer. Still, they went inside. The barn smelled of wet hay and old wood. Sunlight broke through a few cracks, lighting dust in the air. As Clara walked around, her hand brushed against a saddle hanging on the wall. It had a small silver plate engraved, "T. Hale." Her heart stopped. "Elias," she whispered, holding it up. He turned and saw it. His face softened. "That's his," he said quietly. Clara ran her hand over the leather, tears filling her eyes. "He was here. Maybe he came here when the storm started." Elias stepped closer, studying the floor. There were footprints, faint, half washed away by mud. But they led toward the back of the barn. They followed the trail until it ended near a fallen beam. Beneath it, half buried, they found a hat, brown felt, soaked and torn. Clara recognized it instantly from Thomas's photograph. Her hands trembled. Elias gently took the hat from her and brushed off the dirt. "He made it this far," he said softly. "That means he fought to survive. That's something to hold on to." Clara closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for the man she never got to meet. She had crossed states for him, carried dreams of love and a new life, and now all she had was his hat in her hands. But somehow she didn't feel completely broken anymore. Elias placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did what you came to do. You honored him by not giving up." She looked up at him. "And what about you, Elias? Who's going to honor what you've lost?" He looked away, his jaw tightening slightly. Ain't much left to honor, he said quietly. Just mistakes and ghosts. Clara shook her head. You saved me. You're saving this town. That's not a ghost's work. That's a man's. Elias said nothing, but there was a quiet shift in his eyes, a glimmer of gratitude, maybe even healing. They carried what they could back to the cabin. That evening, after lighting the fire, Clara stitched a small patch on the hat to keep it from falling apart. Elias watched her silently, the orange light from the flames painting her face in warm tones. After a while, she spoke again. Elias, when you were a ranger, did you ever feel like, no matter how much good you did, it never made up for the bad? He leaned back in his chair, thinking. Every day, he said finally. There were folks who called us heroes and folks who called us killers. I stopped listening to either. Just tried to do right by the next person who needed it. Clara nodded slowly. Maybe that's all anyone can do. The fire crackled softly. For the first time, she smiled. Not out of joy, but out of understanding. She realized they were both travelers who had lost their destinations, but found a reason to keep walking. Over the next few days, they continued helping other survivors. A few families had returned, trying to rebuild what little they could. Elias became their guide, showing them where the ground was stable, where water could still be drawn from the old well. Clara helped cook and care for children. She patched clothes and cleaned wounds. People began to look at her not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged there. They called her Miss Clara with warmth. And when they needed something fixed, they always turned to Elias, who worked quietly beside her. One afternoon, as they handed food to a family near the edge of the valley, a small boy tugged on Clara's dress. Ma'am, he said shyly, are you and Mr. Elias married? Clara blushed. Oh, no, dear, she said, smiling kindly. We just help each other, the boy grinned. You act like a married couple. Elias, standing nearby, chuckled softly, shaking his head. Kids see things plain, he said later as they walked back. Clara laughed lightly. Maybe they just see kindness as something rare. That night, as the moon rose over the hills, Elias took out an old harmonica from his pack. He began to play a slow tune, soft, lonely, but full of peace. Clara sat by the fire, listening with closed eyes. The melody carried through the quiet valley, touching even the broken parts of her heart. When he finished, she whispered, That was beautiful. He smiled faintly. My brother used to play it. Haven't touched it in years. You should play more, she said gently. It brings life back to this place. He looked at her across the flickering fire. Maybe you're the one bringing life back, he said, almost under his breath. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken things. Gratitude, respect. The beginnings of something neither of them had planned for. The next morning, Clara woke early and went outside. The valley was shining under the sunlight, the mud beginning to dry into firm ground. Smoke rose from new fires where survivors were rebuilding homes. She saw Elias talking with two men near a cart, showing them how to reinforce walls. His voice carried steady and sure. Clara watched him, realizing how much he had done for everyone and for her. When she first saw him, he had looked like a man running from his past. Now he stood like someone rebuilding his future. Later, when he came back to the cabin, she smiled softly. You're turning this place into a town again, he shrugged modestly. Just doing what needs doing. You do more than that, she said. You give people hope. He looked at her a little surprised, then smiled. Guess I learned that from a certain Kansas bride who refused to quit. Clara laughed quietly, blushing at his words. It felt strange to laugh again, but good, like breathing fresh air after being underwater too long. As the sun set that evening, painting the valley gold, they stood together outside the cabin. The wind carried the smell of pine and earth. For the first time, the land no longer looked ruined. It looked like it was healing. Clara turned to Elias and said, You were right. Sometimes helping others is how we help ourselves. He looked at her with the calm, steady gaze of his. And sometimes, he said, you find something worth staying for. Clara didn't answer, but her heart understood what his words meant. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the remains of a broken world, two souls who had lost everything found a reason to start again. The days slowly turned into weeks, and Dry Creek began to show signs of life again. From the ridge, the valley no longer looked like a graveyard of mud and silence. Smoke from small fires rose into the sky. Wooden frames of new cabins stood where homes once were. It wasn't much, but it was hope taking root again. Every morning, Clara and Elias worked side by side. She cooked for the workers, patched torn clothes, and cared for the sick. Elias led the rebuilding, strong, calm, and always thinking ahead. People trusted him, not because he gave orders, but because he listened. One early morning, the sound of hammers echoed through the quiet air. Clara handed water to a few men working near the broken bridge. The river had cut deep into the ground, leaving the only path into town half washed away. Elias stood on the edge of the bank, studying the damage. "We'll have to build a new support beam here," he said, pointing with a stick. One of the ranchers frowned. "That's risky ground, Elias. It could slide again." Elias nodded. "I know, but without this bridge, no one can bring in supplies. We need it strong and steady. I'll check the soil myself." Clara watched him climb down carefully, his boots sinking a little into the soft earth. The sun caught the edge of his hat, and for a moment she thought about how much he'd changed. He wasn't just a lonely ranger anymore, he was becoming the heart of this rebuilding town. By noon, the heat grew strong. Elias and Clara sat under a tree, sharing lunch, just bread and dried meat. Clara looked out over the land and said softly, "It's strange. A few weeks ago, this place looked dead. Now it feels alive again." Elias nodded, taking a sip of water. "That's what people do, Miss Clara. They rebuild even when they think they can't. The land and the heart. They both heal with time." She smiled gently. "You talk like a preacher sometimes," he chuckled quietly. "If I were a preacher, I'd tell folks to listen to people like you. You've done more for this town's spirit than anyone." Her cheeks warmed slightly. "I just do what I can." Before she could say more, a loud cracking sound echoed from the bridge area. Elias jumped to his feet. "Stay here," he called, running toward the sound. Clara followed at a distance. The workers shouted as a section of the muddy hill gave way, sending a rush of dirt sliding down toward the bridge. One of the ranchers slipped, falling toward the edge. Without hesitation, Elias dashed forward, grabbed the man's arm and pulled him to safety. But in that moment, the ground under Elias's feet began to crumble. "Elias!" Clara screamed, running forward. The earth gave way and Elias slipped halfway down the slope, clutching at a tree root. Mud and rocks poured around him. His hat flew off and his face was streaked with dirt. Clara dropped to her knees, reaching out. "Take my hand." He looked up, his grip slipping slightly. "Stay back, Clara. It's too soft." But she didn't listen. Crawling closer, she reached down until their hands met. He grabbed her wrist tightly and with a strong pull she helped him climb up bit by bit until they both rolled onto solid ground. The other men rushed over, helping them stand. Elias coughed, brushing mud from his face. "Everyone all right?" he asked. One man nodded. "Thanks to you, Elias, you saved my life." Elias just nodded, breathing heavily. Claire looked at him, her eyes full of worry and relief. "You could have died," she said softly. He met her gaze. "So could he. I wasn't going to stand by." She shook her head, tears welling up. "You always risk yourself for others. Who risks something for you?" Elias smiled faintly, his voice quiet. "Looks like you just did." That night, the whole town gathered at the cabin to check on him. Elias had a small cut on his arm and a few bruises, but he insisted he was fine. Clara wrapped his arm carefully in clean cloth. The firelight flickered across their faces, warm and gentle. "You should rest," she said firmly. "You've done enough for one day." He smiled slightly. "If I rest, who'll make sure the bridge gets built?" "You'll do it tomorrow," she said, her tone soft but steady. "The world won't end if you take one night off." Elias looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." When the others left, the cabin grew quiet again. Clara sat by the fire, sewing a torn blanket while Elias rested in a chair. Outside, the moonlight touched the wet leaves, turning them silver. After a while, he spoke. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "My mother. She was the kind who never sat still when others were in need. Always found something to fix, someone to help." Clara smiled softly. "She raised a good man then." Elias looked into the fire. "I don't know about that. But she always said, you can't live in the past. It's a road with no end." Took me years to understand what she meant. Clara set her sewing aside and looked at him. "And now you do?" He nodded slowly. "Now I do, because I met someone who showed me there's still a road ahead worth walking." Her heart skipped. "You mean this town?" she asked gently. He looked up, his eyes warm and steady. "I mean you. For a long moment, they just sat there, the fire crackling between them. Neither spoke, but something soft and true passed between their hearts, something more powerful than words. The next morning, Elias was up before dawn again, stubborn as ever. Clara found him outside fixing a broken fence post. She shook her head, smiling. "You don't know how to stay still, do you?" He laughed quietly. "Can't help it. There's always something to fix." Together, they finished the fence before breakfast. The sun rose behind them, painting the sky pink and orange. It was the first sunrise Clara had truly noticed since she arrived. For the first time, she wasn't looking for what she had lost. She was looking at what she had found. As days passed, the bridge was completed. The survivors celebrated with a simple meal outdoors, bread, stew, and laughter. The sound of children's voices returned to the valley. Clara sat near the fire, watching the people she once thought she would never meet again find joy in the little things. Elias walked over and handed her a mug of warm coffee. "You did this, you know," he said. "You gave them hope again," Clara smiled. "No, we did this," Elias shook his head. "Maybe, but it was your heart that started it. I was just the hands." She looked at him for a moment and said softly, "Then maybe we make a good team." He smiled. "The best kind." As night fell, the town sang an old tune by the fire, something about home and healing. The stars shone bright above them, as if the sky itself was smiling down. Clara looked at Elias, who stood quietly beside her, his hat back on his head, eyes reflecting the firelight. She realized then that fate had brought her to Dry Creek not to find the man she was supposed to marry, but to find the man she was meant to meet. And for the first time since the storm, she felt peace in her heart. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of understanding that sometimes life's hardest roads lead you exactly where you need to be. The days grew warmer and the smell of wildflowers returned to the valley. Spring sunlight spread softly across the hills, touching the rebuilt cabins of Dry Creek. What had once been a quiet grave of mud and silence was now alive again. Children laughed near the creek. Horses grazed on fresh grass and smoke rose from kitchens that cooked supper every evening. Clara stood outside her cabin one morning, her apron dusted with flour. She had baked bread for the workers repairing the old church. Her life had found a gentle rhythm. Each sunrise began with chores and each sunset ended with gratitude. She still thought of Thomas sometimes, but now those thoughts came with peace instead of pain. She believed that if he could see her, he would be glad she stayed to help the town he once loved. Elias returned from the ridge, carrying a basket of wild berries. "Morning, Miss Clara," he said with a small smile. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and the sunlight caught the silver in his hair. "You've been up since dawn again," she smiled back. "Someone has to make sure you don't skip breakfast," he chuckled. "You sound like my mother again," Clara laughed softly. "Then I must be doing something right." They shared breakfast under the porch, watching the town wake up. From where they sat, Clara could see children chasing each other around the well, a young couple mending a roof, and the church's new cross being lifted into place. Elias leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Hard to believe this is the same place we found weeks ago." Clara nodded. "It's more than just the same place. It's a new one. It's reborn." He glanced at her, his eyes warm. "And so are you." Clara looked down shyly, not sure what to say. Later that afternoon, a preacher from a nearby town arrived on horseback. The people gathered to meet him, excited to hold a small service of thanks. The preacher was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He looked around at the town and said, "The Lord rebuilds what the storm cannot destroy." His words touched everyone deeply. He offered to lead a prayer on Sunday morning for the whole community, to bless their new beginning. When Sunday came, the church was filled to the door. The building was still rough, wooden benches and unfinished roof, but it was enough. Clara helped seat the children in front. Elias stood near the back, his hat in his hands, quiet but alert as always. The preacher's voice rose through the sunlight streaming in. "You all have faced what few could endure," he said. "But here you stand together. You are living proof that even when the land breaks, the heart of good people cannot be buried." Clara felt tears in her eyes. She thought of the storm, the mudslide, the fear she had faced alone, and how this town, this man beside her, had given her a reason to keep going. When the sermon ended, Everyone stayed behind, sharing food and laughter. For the first time in months, the sound of joy filled the air. Children ran outside, and the older folks sang hymns under the open sky. As the crowd began to thin, Elias walked over to Clara. He was holding something behind his back. "You got a minute?" he asked softly. She smiled. "Always." He handed her a small wooden box. It was simple but beautifully carved. When she opened it, she found a silver locket inside, polished and shining. Inside the locket was a small picture of the new dry creek, taken by one of the traveling photographers who had passed through recently. On the other side was a verse carefully engraved: "New beginnings grow from broken ground." Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Elias, it's beautiful." He shifted his hat awkwardly like a man unsure of his words. "Thought maybe you should have something to remember this place by. You're the heart of this town now. It wouldn't stand without you." She touched the locket gently. "I think it stands because of both of us." He smiled faintly. "Maybe so." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun lower behind the hills. The air smelled of fresh earth and pine. Then Clara said softly, "Elias, what are you going to do now that the rebuilding's almost done?" He looked out over the valley. "I'm not sure. I came here planning to move on once folks didn't need me anymore. But now," he paused, glancing at her, "now I reckon I've found something worth staying for." Her heart thumped gently in her chest. She took a breath. "You mean the town?" He smiled, his eyes kind. "That too. But mostly, you." Clara felt her cheeks warm. She had waited her whole life for words that simple and true. "Elias Ford," she said softly, "you've been my protector since the day we met. But you've been more than that. You've been my friend, my strength, and my home." Elias looked at her for a long time before answering. "You deserve peace, Clara, and if peace means staying right here with you, then that's what I'll do." The preacher, who had quietly watched from the church door, smiled knowingly. "Well," he said gently, "if the good Lord brought two people together through storm and sorrow, perhaps he meant them to rebuild more than just a town." Clara and Elias shared a quiet laugh. Life had taken everything from them, yet given them something even greater in return, a chance to start again, not alone but together. That evening, the townspeople gathered by the creek to celebrate their new beginning. They lit lanterns and set them afloat on the water. Dozens of small lights drifted downstream, shining softly like stars on the surface. Clara and Elias stood side by side, watching the gentle glow. "Each one's a prayer," the preacher said nearby, "a wish for the future." Clara folded her hands. "Then I'll make one," she whispered. Elias looked at her. "What'll you wish for?" She smiled. "For peace. For everyone here. And maybe for a little happiness for us too." Elias nodded. "Then I'll wish the same." As the last lanterns floated away, the night grew quiet except for the sound of the river. Clara felt the weight of the past finally lift from her heart. She had come to Texas as a bride-to-be, filled with hope that turned to despair. But in losing everything, she had discovered something even stronger, the kind of love that grows not from dreams but from trust and kindness built through hardship. The stars spread wide across the sky. The new dry creek lay below them, small but alive, glowing softly like a promise kept. Weeks later, Elias finished building a small corral beside the cabin. He brought 2 horses from a nearby ranch, one for him, one for Clara. When she saw them, her eyes lit up. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. He smiled. "I wanted to. This land's got a future now, and so do we." Clara ran her hand along the horse's mane. "It feels like home," she said quietly. Elias looked at her and nodded. "It is home." One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the hills in golden light, the two of them rode along the ridge where Clara's journey had first begun. The view below was peaceful, the rebuilt town, the shining creek, the people moving like tiny specks of life and hope. Clara stopped her horse and looked around. "When I first came here, I thought my story was ending," she said softly. "But maybe it was just beginning." Elias smiled beside her. "That's how life works, Clara. The hardest roads often lead to the right place." The wind carried the sweet scent of grass and pine. For a long moment they sat there in silence, side by side, the sunset behind them and the town ahead, symbols of all they had lost and all they had found. Clara took a deep breath and whispered, "Thank you, Elias, for saving me that day. And every day since. He looked at her, his eyes gentle. "No, Miss Clara, you saved me." She smiled. "Then I guess we saved each other." The sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of amber. Down in the valley, the lanterns began to glow again as the townsfolk lit them for the evening. Life had returned to Dry Creek, and with it, love had quietly found its place, strong, steady and pure like the land itself. And so, the cowboy bride who once came chasing a dream found something far greater. Not the life she had imagined, but the one her heart truly needed. And beside her stood a man who had carried sorrow and guilt for years. Now finally at peace. Together they watched the stars appear, two souls bound not by chance, but by the simple grace of survival, kindness, and love that endured beyond every storm.